All right, so let's now dig into the how of controlling, or specifically the 3 steps that we take in order to enact control in an organisation. So, as always, our book likes to really overcomplicate things, but we can think of the process of control, or how we actually go about doing control, as having these 3 different components. First of all, we want to be able to measure in some way. So in some cases, this is fairly straightforward, say with trying to measure financial things. In other cases, it can be more complex trying to measure something. So how might we measure creativity? Or sometimes in the middle of trying to do something, it's very hard to actually understand if your outcome is going to be the effect that you're wanting it to. So sometimes we have to mentally measure things in order to actually comprehend, okay, are we on track here and heading in the right direction? We then want to be able to compare against some kind of standard or something that that will give us a benchmark to understand if our measurement has any meaning. So, for example, if we're trying to measure the quality of something, typically we might measure it against some standard. So we might measure it against a template or something that enables us to go, yeah, this is good or isn't good. And often when we measure things, they may not have any meaning unless we can compare it to something that we're trying to reach the standard of. And then depending on the outcomes of our measurement and comparison, we may need to take some actions in order to get things back on track. So if things are not performing to standard, we may need to take some action in order to correct that. So this is the book's way of really overcomplicating this. But essentially what we want to do is start with whatever our goals or standards are. So if we're, say, a band manager, we might have a goal for producing an album and then launching it and doing a tour and trying to achieve maybe some attendance figures. So maybe we're trying to sell out a number of gigs or get a certain number of people along to every show. And maybe we've got some financial goals around the tour making a profit, or maybe we've got some goals around the amount of merch we want to sell or something like that. In terms of standards, maybe we have some kind of way of assessing whether the production of our album is good or not. And this can be a fairly subjective thing, but we have some way of kind of going, yep, we think this is good, or we want to do it again because it's not quite up to standard. Similarly, when we produce, say, merch, we might check the quality of the t-shirts or the stubby coolers or whatever and start to go, yep, these are good enough. Or maybe we even think about how much we might charge based on the quality of those items. So based on that comparison with either where we're headed in terms of what our goal is or the standard that we've set, we're going to measure in some way. And then, so if we think that we're doing okay, we would just keep going. Then if we think that the standard isn't what we're wanting to achieve, or we're not achieving the goals that we're trying to accomplish, we're going to need to continue to go through and continue to take action to recalibrate, either to move towards our goals and our standards, or maybe we might go, well, actually, this goal isn't achievable. Yeah, we wanted to sell out a 1,000-person venue. Maybe we don't have enough fans for that. So maybe we need to change our goal to a 500 capacity venue, et cetera, et cetera. So this gives us a way of starting to think through, do we need to change our goals and standards, or do we actually need to change our performance? So there's a bunch of different ways we can measure. I'm sure some of them are quite intuitive to you. We can just watch and sort of go, is this show good? Are the band performing? Is the crowd happy? Do these things seem to be working okay? We can get feedback from people in terms of asking them, like, how do you think that went? Or what do you think's going on? Or how are you going in your job? Is there anything that you think we can improve? Or do you think you're on track? Do you think there's ways that you can, that would help you do your job better? We might be able to get reports. So this might be, say, with financial things, we might be able to look at our budgets or we might have reports on how much money we've made that we can actually use to evaluate whether or not we are on target and we're meeting the standards that we've set. And we may even have some kind of written report. So maybe people are documenting things go, and then they give you that information that will enable you to actually evaluate if things are going in the right direction and meeting your preferred standards. So this is one that the book mentions. I don't quite know why. Sounds pretty obvious, but often it isn't done, which is basically a way of observing what's going on. So the manager just wanders around. You might think of this happening in, say, on a shop floor or in some kind of manufacturing or retail, where you have a manager just wandering around, kind of observing what's happening and seeing if things can be improved. We can have these other ways of thinking about control. In terms of measuring them, then also thinking about that we might have to measure things differently depending on what they are. So, you know, if you've got someone who's doing accounting for you, the measurement of the accounting work will probably be quite different to if you've got someone doing, say, A&R, and say their performance indicators will be quite different because the nature of their job is different. And so the way that we would understand and measure what they're doing would be quite different. And generally speaking, we try and look for ways that we can measure in quantifiable terms, so numerically in some way. And there's this old maxim that kind of gets around in business quite a lot, which is the idea that you can't manage what you can't measure. So what that suggests is if you're not measuring something, it's going to be very difficult for you to manage it. And of course, in the creative industries, this is a really complex thing. You know, how do you measure a lot of the stuff that goes on in the creative process? You can often measure the outcomes of that. So how many people came to the gig, how many albums have we sold, what are our downloads, all that sort of stuff. But the actual creative output often isn't measurable until those outputs are created. So we've got to have more in tune sort of mental models around thinking about, are things working at a process level to hopefully take us in the right direction? And that means that this idea of not being able to measure and therefore not being able to manage is a little bit more complex, and we need to be sort of more attuned as managers in order to do it well. So then when it comes to, we've got our measurements, so we actually have a sense of, right, this is what we're doing, and maybe we've got some numbers, or maybe we've got some sort of categories of like, yep, this is happening well, or it needs attention. We're going to actually try and measure it against something. So often this will just be some kind of internal standard, like, is this track a good track or not? Is this bass player a good bass player or not? We might not necessarily be able to kind of get a ruler out or measure it in a standard way, but we would have some kind of way of understanding whether or not this is within the range of what is we would consider decent enough quality. And so again, the book gives us this fairly complex diagram that essentially just trying to say that each of these T's means a point in time. So if you're thinking about here that you're manufacturing something, let's say you're producing CDs for the sake of argument, and you are testing the quality of each CD as it's produced. So each one of these T's might be a month. And so you're testing, in January, the quality was, was okay, but not great. Then we shot up in terms of, maybe we're thinking about the number of CDs we're producing. This might be a better measure than the actual quality. So this might be the number of CDs. So in January, we didn't produce as many. In February, things shot up, we got really busy. Then it dropped in March, blah, blah, blah. And then down here, we're sort of hitting the lower limit, which we might think of in terms of production terms. This might be our profitability point. And we know that if we go below this, the business is going to be running at a loss because we're not going to be producing enough CDs to cover our costs in terms of the production facilities and staffing and stuff like that. So we might be measuring the number of CDs that we're producing in this range for us to be able to think about, are we going to be able to make a profit this month? In terms of goods manufacture, this might be things like, you know, if we're producing garments, like if we're a t-shirt manufacturer, you might see sometimes they have like a little quality sticker. This was checked by whoever, and that person might be checking and discarding ones that don't meet the standard. And so this chart here might be a measure of the number of garments that were discarded because they didn't meet the acceptable standard. And we might have a range that we're happy to have, say 10% is, you know, within the limit. But once we reach up here, we're going, oh, this is too many that we're having to throw away because the quality isn't good enough. So we're measuring against some kind of acceptable range of standard, and we're measuring against that. So this is a different way of looking at it. Similar kind of concept though. This is where they've got some kind of nursery that is measuring how many products their output per month, probably per month looking at it. Again, this is like the CD one I said before. So this is like they might set a benchmark, and this might be based on annual figures. So it might be that, you know, across the last 10 years, on average, we've produced just over 1,000 vegetable plants in our month. So this is June's sales. So this is how many we've sold on average every June of vegetable plants. And so this June, we're actually measuring and we're going, oh, we actually only sold 913. So compared to what is our standard, so what is typically expected for us in this month, we're over. But look at this, we're over in some other things. So maybe on balance, and maybe we would want to calculate this financially as well, because some things might be worth more to us than others. We can get some benchmarks and sort of go, well, what does this mean in terms of our actual sales figures? Has something changed? So people are not wanting to buy vegetables anymore, but they seem to be wanting to buy flowers more. Does that mean we need to change? And next year, we need to be ready for that and produce less vegetables and produce more flowers, so that we're actually giving ourselves meaningful information. Because as you can imagine, if we just had these figures on their own, they might not tell us very much, because, you know, it's great to know that we sold 913 vegetable plants, but that doesn't tell us much in terms of what we might need to do for next year, except that maybe this will be the same, but this might also suggest a downward trend. So we need to be able to interpret these numbers in some way and take meaningful action. And so that's our last phase of the control process, is act. And so where we sort of are able to measure something or assess it in some way, compare it to some kind of standard or compare it to a goal, we can either take immediate corrective action. So in situations where we can actually kind of see things happening immediately. So if someone's doing something that we go, actually, that's not going to meet the standards. Maybe can you do it this way instead? We can take that immediate action. Otherwise, we may need to do things after we've actually been able to measure and test them. So sales figures being a good example, that we may not be able to actually see that in real time. You know, if we're doing gigs, we're going to know the numbers through the door pretty much by the time the show starts. So that might be able to give us good information about how many people are there, but that's not necessarily going to be able to help us in that moment to be able to get more people in the door. It's not like we can just start going outside and saying, you know, dragging people off the street. So we need to be able to use that information in future and sort of go, all right, well, what does this mean? So, you know, we thought we'd get 500 people to this show. We only got 300. What does that mean? Does that mean we need to go into a smaller venue? Does it mean that it was just bad weather and so, yeah, it wasn't great, but we probably don't need to do anything. It's just that we had a bit of bad luck on that night because the weather was poor and so people didn't come. or maybe there were other competing acts on that night that meant that not enough people came because they were going to other shows. So we're able to actually evaluate and think about what does this mean and what difference would we make next time by doing it differently. And then we can also think of control in terms of when it might take place. So I sort of alluded to that a second ago in terms of sometimes we might be thinking about changing our responding to what's happened after the fact, but we can also do it before the fact. So if we're thinking about the actual starting point, the book refers to this as feed-forward control. So this is where we're anticipating either what might go wrong or actually just anticipating how we might try and measure whether this is working or not. So if we're, say, planning gigs in advance, we might be able to set up some kind of sales process so that we start to monitor how many tickets are sold day by day. And that's going to give us an indication of how many people are likely to come to the show. And based on that, we might be able to change things before the actual show comes about. So we might be able to say, all right, based on the number of ticket sales, maybe we need to release a new batch of tickets at a cheaper price or do a 2-for-1 offer because we're able to actually see in advance what's actually happening and be able to predict and anticipate what might happen at the point where it becomes important. We might be able to do this in terms of albums and stuff like that by starting to plan forward shows. So we might see this where big touring acts, often they'll release a show, and depending on whether that show sells or not, they might add additional dates either side. Right, so if they've got a show booked for the Friday night, they'll release tickets for that show to stimulate interest in it, and then hopefully that'll sell out quite quickly, and that will enable them then to add a show on the Saturday night, and then that will then gives them that ability to manage, so that then if the second show doesn't sell out, well, okay, we don't need to add the third show, and so we don't need to then take on the production costs associated with that third show. So this is a way of sort of thinking about feeding forward and thinking about how are we going to monitor the things that matter and measure the things that matter in order to control what we will then do in future. Concurrent control is actually looking at things as they happen, and correcting as they happen. So if we're, say, watching somebody manufacturing a garment and we can see that they're not doing it correctly, we might stop them and say, hey, I think your needle's not sharp enough on that t-shirt that you're sewing, so let's change your needle so that you can continue to make that t-shirt to the quality that we need it. So you're doing it in the moment. And then where we're trying to solve problems after they occur, so this is where we're getting some kind of reports, or we're getting something that gives us information after the situation, we can then use the feedback from those reports and that information to try and correct things for the next time. So again, probably all quite intuitive and fairly obvious, but if you think about how you might apply these different techniques, obviously if we can set up things in advance and feed forward our controls, that's going to be ideal, because it means that we're going to be able to actually control things before they happen and manage things as they, just even before they happen or as they are about to happen. Or maybe we're able to control as things are happening, but then in order to improve things over time, we also want to be able to think about how we're going to understand either what went wrong or where we can actually improve things after the fact. And it's usually the case that until we've done something, it's hard to know what we can improve. So all points in time are relevant and useful to us when we're thinking about control measures. All right, so that covers off the actual process of how we might think about controlling. And in our next video, we're going to actually look at what should we be controlling. So I'll see you there.